welcome everyone to this program on an amazing family. We are excited to be here today with people who are passionate about history and the traditions that this represents. I will tell you, the first time I encountered the Quander family was when we were doing research on women's suffrage and looking at some of the groups that participated in the lobbying and support for the 19th Amendment. And one of the people was Nellie Quander, who was the first national president of a sorority called the Alpha Kappa Alphas. And I'm sure you've all heard of the AKAs. But she was an extraordinary woman, and we're looking forward to hearing more about her and her amazing family today. I just want to acknowledge some of the many people who have helped make this day happen. I am Pamela Johnson. I'm the president of the WNDC Educational Foundation. We were founded by the Women's National Democratic Club in 1991, actually by Shirley Henderson, one of our past presidents, who is with us today. And Laura Whitaker, who's our current president, is here as well. But the foundation was created to really celebrate history, women's history in particular, and civic engagement, and also to preserve the beautiful Whittemore House where we are today. We are thrilled to partner with the DC History Center, and I'm going to turn this over to Laura Hagood and to ask her to introduce our panel. So thank you all for coming.
All right, thank you so much. Can everybody hear me? Yes? Okay, excellent. Let's do this. I am Laura Brower Hagood, and I'm the executive director of the DC History Center. I have to tell you that for almost a year and a half, I've been doing all of my speaking on Zoom. And so I could not be more thrilled to be in a room full of such talented and amazing men and women. And so thank you for being here together. This really just means so much. I hope the window isn't closing on doing this again. I have a little sweet spot in here. Anyway, thank you. So we are also absolutely delighted to partner with the WNDC Educational Foundation for this book talk featuring Mr. Rohulamin Quander, who is the author of The Quanders, since 1684, an enduring African-American legacy. And I have my copy of the book right here, especially for the folks on Zoom, so you can see this beautiful cover. The artist is Mr. Quander's wife, Carmen, who I believe is seated right over here. Yes. Congratulations for that. So Mr. Quander is joined by Ms. Alicia Butler and Mr. Emery Calhoun, who are both social studies educators based in DC schools. If you're not already familiar with us, the DC History Center is a nonprofit, community-supported educational and research organization, and we were founded in 1894. And we're currently located at the Carnegie Library in downtown DC. We, through research, scholarship, youth education, and adult programs, we deepen understanding of our city's past to connect, empower, and inspire. We take great pride in showcasing the most recent scholarship and research in DC history through book talks like this, but also through our biannual magazine, Washington History, and our annual conference, the DC History Conference. So if this is information and resources that you enjoy, please come find us at the dchistorycenter.org website, where you'll find much, much more. I do take this opportunity to acknowledge two extraordinary women whose dedication and deep love of DC history are truly exemplary. Pamela Johnson and Judy Hubbard. Is Judy here? I haven't seen her yet. I hope she's online. Out of town. Out of town.
She's actually on a boat.
Oh, okay, good for her. Our program today really wouldn't have been possible without Pamela's dedicated work. And Judy also served on the DC History Center's board for many years and remains a great ally and friend. So shout out to her, and truly a heartfelt thank you to these remarkable women. On my team, I also want to acknowledge Maren Orchard, who played an important role in facilitating today's work. So, hi, Maren. So today we are gathered to learn more from Mr. Quander about his book, which is truly a fascinating account of one of the oldest continuously documented African-American families in the country. With likely roots in Ghana, the first American Quanders were enslaved in Maryland and Virginia, including at President George Washington's Mount Vernon plantation. Following generations of enslavement, the family has produced U.S. Army generals, Tuskegee Airmen serving in World War II, and the first national president of the Alpha Kappa Alpha Sorority. Their stories alone are powerful and engaging snapshots of American history. In this work, Mr. Quander harkens back to the earliest records of the Quander family, demonstrating how the Quanders used the judicial system to affirm their rights in ways that were truly courageous and, frankly, in my mind, awe-inspiring. Mr. Quander says, and I quote, "17th century Quanders had no sense of how history would remember them. Life was hard, and their focus was on daily survival. Being Black in America was difficult and still is. They lived when there were no civil rights laws, but they stood up for themselves anyway. And in the face of interminable racism, they claimed their rights, sought redress, and worked to see that no one took unfair advantage of their color, their poverty, or lack of education." End of quote. This 300-year legacy of perseverance and resilience, of strength and bravery in the face of adversity and hatred, is the true subject of this modest volume. These inspiring qualities are further exemplified by Mr. Quander himself. A native Washingtonian, he is a retired senior administrative law judge for the District of Columbia. He holds a BA from Howard University and a JD from Howard University School of Law. This is his fourth book, and I encourage you to reach out to him if you're interested in his work. In fact, for those of you who are in the room, I believe he does have all four of them with him today. Additionally, we are very lucky to call him a trustee of the DC History Center. Mr. Emery Calhoun is a social studies teacher at Dunbar High School, where Mr. Quander also went to school. Mr. Calhoun employs creative methods in the classroom to highlight Black history, even inviting students to call his aunt who lived through the civil rights movement. And Mr. Calhoun, I hope we're going to hear more about your aunt. She sounds amazing. Mr. Calhoun has experience teaching internationally from participating in a 2015 and 2016 teacher exchange program between the US and South Africa, which sounds like that was probably an amazing experience. Our moderator is Ms. Alicia Butler. She is a social studies teacher at McKinley Technology High School and the 2019 National History Teacher of the Year, the first teacher in DC to be awarded the prize. So congratulations. We are very honored to have you both with us today. Yeah. So her approach in the classroom is to tell history as an ongoing story, still unfolding. And so with that, I invite Ms. Butler to begin our conversation with Mr. Calhoun and Mr. Quander. Thank you so much.
Welcome, everyone. We are here to discuss, in my opinion, nothing short of a literary masterpiece. However, before we begin our discussion, Judge Quander would like to begin with a short presentation.
Good afternoon. First of all, I'd like to thank the women for having me here today. It's such an honor to be here again. I've been here for a number of events, but none of my own personal being featured as the man of the hour. I'm going to show a video presentation, but I'm not going to do too much narrating because we're going to spend most of our time talking, but I'm going to go through because it sets the tone. I will mention a couple of things. Let's see how this is going to work. There we are. Let me move over a little bit to the side. Sorry if I'm blocking anybody. Beginning in 1684, that's our first documented year. We've had a number of family reunions, and our history, our recorded history is 1684, but we are listed in 1670s. That is the will that provided for the freedom, executed in 1684, and went into effect in 1686 upon death of the enslaver. Land family received in 1696. This gentleman, look at him carefully. If you see the cover of the book, you'll see this man, Charles Henry Quander. He was an enslaved man on Quander Road. At Mount Vernon, we have a memorial dedicated to the enslaved who were there. And this memorial was put there in 1983. And according to our oral history, because there are no written records, we have about 5 to 6 ancestors buried there. This man is Felix Quander. He built the road, not by himself, but the road going down to Mount Vernon. You ride on Mount Vernon Highway. Well, the road that preceded that, which was a railroad bed, he was part of the group that laid that in the 1860s. This man, John Pearson Quander, Civil War veteran, was the father of Nellie Quander, and he was selected, he was a corporal when the Grand Army of the Republic came here in 1915 to celebrate the 50-year anniversary of the end of the war. He was selected to deliver the keynote address for the colored troops. We have many newspaper articles talking about various people, and that's just a sample of it. This lady here is Susie Quander. She is a sister of Nellie Quander, descended directly from the Mount Vernon enslaved, standing on the lawn of the White House in 1932. This is Emma Quander, treasurer of North Brentwood, Maryland. Dr. John Thomas Quander, graduate of Howard University School of Medicine, 1909. James Quander, family home in Upper Marlboro, Maryland, Christmas, about 1910. We have been in the Smithsonian 3 times, not 4. And this is from one of the exhibits. Quickly about that, Dr. John Thomas Quander's shingle, Sadie Chin Quander, Frederick Douglass. And that typewriter is the one that Buck Franklin, if you heard of him, Buck Franklin used that typewriter to report to the black press the burning down of Black Wall Street. That's the typewriter. John Hope Franklin's father and John W. Franklin's grandfather. That's the door of no return in Ghana. There I am standing there, the last site that our ancestors saw before they were transported. We just closed an exhibit last week, Lives Bound Together, Slavery at George Washington's Mount Vernon. It's there almost 5 years, and there I am standing at the door, at the entrance there, just pointing out Nancy Quander's name. My wife and I were at an event standing on the lawn. The exhibit, Lives Bound Together, Gladys Quander Tansel, the man I told you who was sitting on the buckboard, who's on the cover of the book. This is his granddaughter, the first African-American interpreter guide at Mount Vernon, Gladys Quander Tansel. I dedicated that. That's a replica, it's rebuilt slave cabin. Based on photographs, we rededicated that in 2007. It's accurate. It's one of the Quander homes on Quander Road. There are 4 Quander streets: Fairfax County, Prince William County, Prince George's County, and Washington, D.C. They just unveiled Quander Street, signed last month. You're wondering where it is? It's at first in New Jersey, Southeast. I had hair then. I wonder what happened. I'm in Ghana. That particular Quander Street is from Quander Street in Prince William County. We are in the auditorium, not the auditorium, in the Oval Office with President Clinton. There's Gladys Quander Tansel in blue, and that handsome guy on her right is yours truly. Nellie Quander, Alpha Kappa Alpha Pearl, first president of the Alpha Kappa, first national president of the sorority. My wife, the professional artist who's sitting right over here, she painted that. Quander Street, Emmett Drive, Fairfax County. Quander Road School, West Potomac Park High School on Quander Road. That's the Quander building. Quander Road School. There he is again, Civil War veteran. Tuskegee Airman on the right. We have 2. Quanders in military service from a family reunion. Gentleman on the second from the left, Richard Ignatius Quander, a career military, and he was in the Army band. This picture was taken, we're not sure if it's World War I or Spanish-American War. Peter Mercer Quander. There I am, the tall guy in the middle. We have 4 generals, the only family in the United States, definitely only African-American, and we think we are the only one, 4 generals. The second one, the one on the far right, Leo Brooks Jr., was the second African-American commandant. That's a number 2 position at West Point. He was the second one, 2002 to 2004, African-American one. The one in uniform next to him on the right is the current commandant. We have had 2 of the 3 African-American commandants. That's Mark Quander. He was just installed in May. We've been very involved in religious life. This is St. Mary's the Assumption Catholic Church, Upper Marlboro, Maryland. The door on the right is the colored entrance. We had to, because of segregation, go in and out of that door. That's a historical marker on the building across the street. And that's Alpha Street Baptist Church. Many of you might know the Quanders affiliated with Virginia Alpha Street Baptist Church. My father was in the first row on the right. When the Catholic Church reinstated the diaconate after 800 years, he was one of the original 16 of the deacons. There we are at the same place I talked about. We've had our family reunions at many places, and this particular one was at Mount Vernon. There we are, the tricentennial, 1984. Thank you. Okay. Thank you very much. I was supposed, there it is. That's the cover of the book that you are encouraged to buy. And the next slide is similar, except it has the contact information as to how you can access a book if you're interested. There it is, The Quanders since 1684, an enduring African-American legacy. And you can look us up at www.quanderquality.com or email us at info@quanderquality.com. My pleasure. I could take a shorter time, which I did, because I wanted to get to a shorter time with the slides because I wanted to get to the conversation. Thank you. I'm yours.
Judge Quander, I wanted to say it is an absolute pleasure to meet you. Rarely do we have opportunities to sit and converse with authors of books that kept you up all night because they were such page turners. I wanted to first say that I absolutely loved your book, and being still fairly new to the DMV area, I had to confess that I had never heard of the Quander family. But after reading about your family's journey, I will never forget it. Yeah. Telling the history of your ancestors shed light on the history of Black people as a whole in this country. I have no blood ties to the Quanders, but as I read your book, I experienced an immense amount of pride in the accomplishments and triumphs of your ancestors. Every Quander win and act of resistance to injustice was a triumph for Black people as a community. That, to me, is what is at the center of the study of the history of Black people in this country. Coming from different clans and nations to create a new people with shared collective experiences. And that is also why it is so important to teach it in our classrooms, not as an outlier, but as a central part of the history of this country. So let's get right to the book. We have many other American slave narratives dating back to the 16th century. But why is the story and family history of the Quanders, in your opinion, both unique and an essential component to the history of not only the DMV area, but also as the country as a whole?
Well, to me, all history is important. Each and every one of us has a history. But with our particular case, we realize that we are blessed because we were able to hold on to our original African name, got a little anglicized from Quando in the Akan language of Ghana to Quando here. And we believe what happened, the forebear answering to untrained ears, Quando heard I am Quando. So we find our name referenced in the 1670s, fully documented forward from the 1680s. And as we were able to research and looking, we didn't have the internet, we didn't have cell phones, we didn't have the advantages that people have now, but a pattern began to emerge where, because they were blessed and got their freedom at an early stage in 1686, there are more branches than one, but that particular branch, they were able to establish themselves to set out a tone of standing up for rights that they didn't know for sure that they even had. So every time they lost a case, it was a blessing to us because it created a record. It was an inspiration. The stumbling blocks constantly became stepping stones. The lemons constantly became lemonade. So a pattern emerged that we said must be captured and must be shared.
Thank you. George Washington, Mount Vernon, Francis Scott Key, the lawyers from Marbury versus Madison. These are all names and locations that I'm required to teach in my classroom. The Quander family is connected to almost all of them. Because we have such a limited amount of time and I have so many other questions that I would love to ask you, could you briefly explain how the Quanders are connected to the Washingtons?
Well, the Quanders are connected to the Washingtons in a number of ways. George Washington inherited Mount Vernon and moved in there in the 1758-59 period. And when he got there, there were some ancestors of the Quanders already there. And one of those was Suki Bay, and Suki Bay's daughter, Nancy. When George Washington wrote his will, he provided for the freedom of his enslaved people. And as soon as Nancy got free, right after that, she married a free Black man named Charles Quander. We don't know exactly when the marriage took place, but shortly after 1800, apparently, introduced the Quander name to the Mount Vernon plantation at that time. In addition to that, oral history has it, and we're pretty sure the Mount Vernon ladies even acknowledge that it is true. Bushrod Washington, George Washington's nephew, is the alleged father of a man named West Ford. And West Ford, born of a slave named Venus and a quote unknown father, which is sort of like an open secret as to who his so-called unknown father allegedly was. And the Quanders are descended from Bushrod, apparently, through West Ford. So we have a long history going right back into George Washington's blood. And when you tell people about George Washington had no children, perhaps not, there's some who say he did, but there appears to be an acknowledgement that the Quanders from that group are descended from Bushrod Washington. That's the connection. And there are other connections too. Time doesn't permit, but that's the main one. So Francis Scott Key was the Quander family attorney, one of the family members suing for his freedom under a will, and they didn't give it to him because the word free wasn't used. Eventually, he was able to get somebody to take it to court for him. The court ruled that the intent of the person was freedom. So Francis Scott Key was the family attorney in that case.
I was so amazed by the amount of research that you conducted, and in many ways still continue to pursue, because it felt that even in your later chapters, you were still finding out new information about your family. And it was just really a chapter after chapter. I was so amazed. Can you describe and provide insight into your process of uncovering information about your family that goes not only back to the 17th century here in Maryland, but even back to Ghana?
Well, I went to Howard in 1961 as a freshman, and I did not really know, because I knew of generically of a Quander family reunion, had never been to it. But when I went to Howard, the students kept calling me Mr. Quando, Mr. Quando. Well, I said, no, it's Quander. I didn't think anything much. After I've been there a while, somebody said to me, you know, you don't seem to know your own ancestry. That name is a Fanti name. And that's from the Ghana area. And I asked some older relatives, and they said, oh, yeah, well, we heard it back there somewhere, pointing over the shoulder. Yeah, the name did used to be Quando, but apparently our census taker changed it and took the O off and became ER. Well, that was an enlightening point. Went to Howard University School of Law, and I was at my first Quander reunion in 1968. I realized it was a long time ago. And I met a lot of Quanders that I hadn't known before. And it piqued my interest, and I started researching. I talked to more students at Howard. I found out more about the Akan pronunciations, that the QU of English and the KW of the Akan language were the same, and how the name, they were telling me about all the Quandos and Amquandos were related ancestrally in the Ghanaian area, and they had migrated across the continent from the Abyssinian highlands from the 900s, coming to settle in that area in the 1400s. And then everybody with that name was connected from this, if not by blood, they were historically from the same area, the same village, or the same general area, and migrated over to when they couldn't migrate anymore, they got to the ocean. And so we are part of that ancestral group. And when I went to Ghana, I discovered there are people there with the name QU, name spelled as we spell ours, because the language wasn't originally written. And when the British helped in writing it, they didn't know so much about the KW of the Akan. They pronounced it and spelled it QU. So we see the naming pattern traces. And of course, I did my DNA just to be sure. And I knew that my mother's side came from India and the Caribbean, but I just wanted to be sure that Ghana showed up. And I'm glad to say it did. Yeah.
I was so amazed by the amount of research that you conducted. And, you know, in some cases, you were talking about how family members completely disappeared from the records. Cases where trails went cold, elders transitioning before you had the opportunity to interview them, and sometimes even hostility from family members. What did you feel was the biggest challenge in uncovering the history of your family?
Well, I think the biggest challenge came from a lot of people who were trying to say whether the Quanders from Maryland and the Quanders from Virginia were the same, whether we were related. And of course, as we got into history, we discovered that besides the name Quander, there must be about 10 people named Henry and about 5 named Henrietta, and they were on both sides of the river. And at this spot, both sides of the river, in some places, the river is less than a mile wide. So the opposition, or not so much an opposition, the prove it factor kind of went away. And as the older people transitioned to glory, the younger people said, hey, wait a minute, we know more now than they did then, even though we came after them. And the decision was made that there's no question that we are definitely one family. We have 4 different branches, 2 free, 2 enslaved, but we come from the same ancestral root. So it's just a question of how far you are down the line, because every Quander is not my first cousin. If you were my brother or sister or first cousin back in 1684, you can imagine where we are now in terms of our relationship. Still same family. We are many, but we are one. And we say, blessed be the ties that bind our hearts in kindred love.
What motivated you to continue and not give up? And do you have any advice for people with similar passions, encountering the same obstacles, just trying to uncover their family's history, or where to even start? Any suggestions?
Well, I would take Paul Laurence Dunbar's remarks and poem, keep a plugging away. Perseverance soon is king. That's the key right there. We have a lot of people here in this room probably who have some ancestry to Dunbar High School. And even though she said I went to Dunbar, I didn't. I went to John Carroll, but my father's a proud graduate of Dunbar, class of 1936. It takes time. It takes effort. And we have tools today that we didn't have then. So when you got the DNA, you've got the internet, you have ancestors, you need to catch up with them. Catch them not with a notepad, but with a tape recorder to catch every word. Because what happened with us, somebody would say something that ties to 1920, and that's an isolated fact. That's a hypothetical date. Then you'll see something else that goes to 1880, and then you say, oh, there's the connection. So this is very, very important. We're just learning something new all the time. Not today, but I just learned something new a couple of days ago that ties someone else in the family tree. We didn't know where he fit. And now we got to investigate a little further, but we think we're getting there. Yeah.
This question is from Mr. Calhoun. How do we bring that energy and that passion for exploring our roots into our classroom?
Well, as you know, Ms. Butler, that is the million-dollar question that we have to work with every day. Earlier, it was mentioned that I also utilize family members to teach history. And I think that's how you have to do it. I think that when you allow the children to see themselves in the history, and we have the big names, but it's the little people who actually do the work. And because it's the little people who actually do the work, I think it's important that their stories are told. And so if you involve the children and get their family stories, it sparks that interest. In fact, it sparked that interest in myself, and I wound up writing my personal family history. And it was a journey. And my history doesn't go back to 1684. At least I can't, find those connections. And I know the immense amount of work that went into that. So I just take my hat off and applaud Mr. Quander.
Okay. There were cases, while I was in college or recently as a teacher in class teaching a lesson where I found, myself getting emotional, retelling the specific stories of Black people that have suffered extreme persecution and oppression in this country, people that I'm not even related to. I'm thinking in the case of some of the family members that you discussed in your books, like Felix Quander, and everything he endured by being continuously targeted by the Virginia authorities coming out of Reconstruction. What type of emotions did you experience reading about events that actually happened to your family members? And how did you navigate through those feelings?
Well, actually, you're talking about cousin Felix Quander. I had an exhibit some years ago called Negro Thief or Honorable Man. And Felix Quander was one of the family members, born just right after the war, Civil War. And he was trying to make a way, actually before the war, he was trying to make a way and constantly was being buffeted and accused. And to be honest with you, I think he was a bit of a ruffian, but that didn't necessarily make him a criminal. So the fact that it started out over somebody's chickens, he said the chickens were his and somebody either took them or they wandered off and took them back. Next thing you know, he's all in trouble with the press and with not the press, but with the law enforcement, which caught the press. And I think that these people they they could paint a negative picture, but if you use them as a source of strength, you can see that he and the group infected with him did not give up. And they left us a legacy to be proud of and build upon. So that's why I call him Negro thief, or in some place I call him colored thief or honorable man. And I'm inclined to say it was a little bit of both. He was a vagabond, but he was very colorful. And so when we talk about things in the family, he catches a lot of attention.
I have to admit, that was one of my favorite chapters in the book.
Mine as well. And I wanted to say that that is what it's all about, because that's what the students connect with.
Yeah.
They see people like Felix in their own family.
Yeah, absolutely.
I wanted to also ask you, did you notice any modern day parallels and obstacles that Black people face today and the obstacles that your ancestors endured throughout the book? For example, as I read Felix Quander's issues with laws that were clearly set up to entrap Black people after Reconstruction, many people could kind of compare them to some laws today that are labeled as new Jim Crow laws or laws that are a part of the school to prison pipeline system. Were there any parallels that really got your attention as you were doing your research and writing your book?
Yes, his name is George Floyd. Right up at the beginning of the book, this book was dedicated to the memory of George Floyd. Get your knee off my neck, I can't breathe. And when I look and think about the things that we have gone through, I'm a child of the 60s at Howard University. Every weekend, we had freedom rides going to Eastern Shore, Maryland, and Virginia, and North Carolina. We had fighting and struggling to get the Civil Rights Act of 64 and Voting Rights Act, public accommodations. All of that passed. And here we are, 60 years later or so, we're going through the fight all over again. And this is so upsetting, but we have to see, those of us who thought, well, now we're here, we've arrived. No. Vigilance, eternal vigilance. People like John Lewis, and people I had the privilege of being in a class with Stokely Carmichael when I was at Howard, one class, and people like that. They were great inspirations, and we have to still remember we're on a mission, and we have a long way to go, because anybody who thinks we have, quote, arrived, we have not. There's a lot of work to do.
Thank you. At one point, you described actually meeting Walter Bell, a descendant of Thomas Wheeler, a white man in the 17th century who tried to legally trick your free ancestors into indentured servitude. Can you describe what that was like meeting him? And do you have any advice for people who might come across the descendants of people who wronged their ancestors? I'm reading more and more of cases, people that are, studying their own history and are being actually, tracking down the people that owned their ancestors.
Okay.
Any advice?
Well, let me go back a little bit. Walter Ball was a descendant of Ignatius Wheeler, and most of you in this area have heard of Wheeler Road. And Walter Ball called me one day after an article appeared in the Washington Post and introduced himself as a direct descendant of Ignatius Wheeler. And Ignatius Wheeler's brother, Thomas, was quite a vagabond and quite a trickster. And a couple of the girls, Quander girls, he was trying to trick them into servitude. And Walter Ball told me that his ancestor uncle was quite a vagabond. And if I really checked into the criminal records of Prince George's County, I would find him there very colorfully represented. That was a very nice way of putting him. And on my father's mother's side, we went to South Carolina, this is not Quanders, and we looked up some of the ancestors, the white ancestors of my father's mother's people. And I discovered I'm a candidate, although I haven't applied, and I'm eligible to be a son of the American Revolution. These were very, very prominent people. And my father was very afraid that they'd have a strong rejection attitude. But I was pleasantly surprised when I went down there, and they kept me at a bit of a distance at first. Said, well, we thought somebody was out there, we just didn't know who. And they were willing to meet me, but they didn't invite me over for tea. They said, well, why don't we meet at the library? And they were very open. So I think the times have changed somewhat, but don't fool yourself. It's still Jim Crow in some corners. But they were very willing and accepting and interested in knowing who we were, just as we were interested in knowing who they are. I think there's a more openness now as far as interracial relationships, and we see it on television, all the commercials. And then there were when my father came along in the teens and 20s and 30s and 40s.
Thank you. This question is actually for
Well,
Mr. Calhoun.
can I just jump on that? Because it struck me, the book is fascinating. Everybody needs to get a copy of the book. And I have to say this if I don't get a chance, between at least, I can see this book being used in the classroom in 4th grade, 5th grade. I could teach it in DC history, US history. It's a book that can cover all of these particular areas. So I just wanted to make sure that I made that point. The book is really phenomenal.
When I was working on it, I had a copy editor working with me, and I said, I want the book to be something that 9th graders could grasp it and fully engulf it. And so we targeted toward that age group and above and below.
And that actually was going to be something similar to the question I was going to ask you, Mr. Calhoun. How do we navigate through teaching tough history in our classrooms where our students are informed, enlightened, but not embittered and crippled?
Well, there's a couple ways I think that we have to approach, especially stories like the Quander family. Well, we're fortunate in Washington, DC to have access to Quanders. In fact, my history goes back before I actually met Judge Quander. I worked with his daughter, who was a teacher in DCPS at Anacostia. So there are a lot of Quanders around. And I think that, if we utilize them as guest speakers and bring them into the classroom, dedicate a section or a portion of their book for a reading in the class, and then, have them interact in that kind of way, I think that's one of the ways that we can engage our students into this history, because they should be vested into it. This is DC history. I mean, from the early settlers, you can catch it there. You can catch it, the Civil War part. This is a very rich text.
Yeah, I couldn't agree. I couldn't agree more. I was so impressed and proud of Henry Quander and Margaret Pug. I admire her so. I cannot wait to tell her story in my classroom next year. Just an amazing woman. And I was so impressed by their continued use of the judicial system in the 17th century, particularly that of Margaret Pug, where she went to court by herself numerous times, or Henry Quander, going to court to stand up against a law that required him to pay a tax for Margaret Pug. And he argued he shouldn't have to, because she was a free woman and not enslaved. I think that was just remarkable. Do you like to think that any of that savviness for the legal system resides in you and influenced you to become a judge?
I guess subconsciously, if not directly, yes. Because as I like to tell people when I go out to speak to groups, that these were examples where they may have lost the decision, but they won the legacy, because they created a path for us to subsequently find and subsequently be strengthened by the fact that the forebears were determined. They were determined. The courts had not given them any rights. There was no 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, no Civil Rights Act, no 19th Amendment for women's rights, but they stood up and stood out. And the fact that they were so focused and so determined has been an inspiration to us. Everywhere I go, I always tell groups of people that you have to be inspired. You don't have to use basketball or football or movie or musicians as your heroes. Look closer to home. You got grandma, you got grandpa, you have a man across the street, a cousin, a lady around the corner, a teacher, somebody indeed. And so I also say the Quanders are by no means the only ones. We are but one. There are a number of families here in this town that have outstanding histories. And of course, many of you know the Syphax family. We were in Mount Vernon. Our ancestors were in Mount Vernon together. Only the Syphaxes were Martha Washington's enslaved, if you can enslave anybody. And the Quander ancestors were George Washington's enslaved, but they were there together. And other family names too, that you may not necessarily know, that are of a parallel prominence.
And I like that you kind of talked about that, because that's a picture right there last year with me and my students. I take them every year to Mount Vernon to see not necessarily George Washington's place of residence, but to see the slave cabins. And every year we lay a wreath at the monuments. And
is that Brenda Parker then?
The actress,
Yes.
she said, yep.
Yeah, that's Brenda Parker.
Martha.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. She plays Carolyn Branham and other enslaved women, yes. Mhm.
So even though I wasn't familiar with the Quander family, I was and just didn't know it. And I'm happy to know that I'm introducing my students to them as well. So I actually wanted to thank you because they really enjoy that field trip every year that I take them.
That monument was put there in 1983 after a contest among Howard University students because the Mount Vernon ladies decided they needed more than a flat marker. They wanted an upright. And they had a contest and they had six groups. That is the one that was dedicated in 1983. And we have a program every year between the last Saturday in September or early October where we give tribute to those who are buried there.
Thank you. Quander Street at First Street and New Jersey Avenue, Southeast Washington, D.C. You wrote about it in your book. Could you tell the audience the historical connection and how you were able to get it just declared a historical site and get a marker there to celebrate the history of it?
Well, I don't usually brag about it, but you brought it up. There are 4 Quander streets, not 1, not 2, not 3, but 4. And the Quander Street that you were referring to, it was there the street was there in the 1880s, didn't have a name. And I don't know whether we haven't been able to find any council action. And I don't think they're naming any street after any colored people in the 1890s. So I think they just put up a sign, but maybe. So it was there from the 1890s to 1943. World War II came along. They needed to expand the Navy Yard. So Quander Street in Van, V-A-N, went out of existence. And then when the city got the land back and they were going to take the building down, I petitioned the city council to restore the name Quander, and they put a van back also to that same street area, and they did. So the street was put back in 2015, and the sign Quander Street was just put up last month. If you go to the baseball stadium and you come out and go to the right towards the metro, you'll walk past Quander Street. It's 2 blocks. But it's 2 blocks more than most people got, so we'll take it. There's Quander Road, which many of you may know in Fairfax County, Quander Street in Prince William County, and Quander's Promise in Bowie.
That's just amazing. And that actually leads to a question for you, Mr. Calhoun. With that being said, do you believe that we as teachers are doing enough to teach and preserve the historical significance of sites linked to Black history and Black families here in the district as the city experiences its current rapid and aggressive gentrification? And if not, what do you think we as educators can do?
That's a loaded question. You set it up for me. You said, but the reality is that no is the answer to the question. Number one, there's so much more that needs to be done to preserve the legacies of Native Washingtonians and members of the surrounding area, honestly. But you also have to take into consideration when you're thinking about gentrification and whatever you want to say. I teach at Dunbar. So Dunbar, the oldest African-American high school in the country. I was talking to somebody earlier. We have a museum where we actually preserve the histories of a lot of the Dunbar residents, and we capture some of that history there. I think that those kinds of things need to be happening in every high school so that the histories, again, I keep harping on this. I think the way you touch people is you touch them through their family and the histories of their family. They can see the students who, go to Ballou, they can see that their grandfather was at Ballou, or, those things matter. Those things matter, and it makes a difference in how they approach education.
I wanted to ask Judge Quander, has the Quander legacy, and it is such a beautiful one, but has it ever felt for younger Quanders like it's almost impossible to live up to? Has it ever felt in some cases like a burden?
Oh, is that what happened? I have to admit, I have not been able to get the younger generation to pick this up. And I'm concerned that when I go, it may go. And I'm trying to get as much interest as possible. If anybody wants to know, the papers, the Quander papers, are overwhelmingly at Howard University, the Moreland Spingarn Research Center. The Washingtoniana collection of the DC Public Library has it also. But I like to document and put everything as much as I can in writing. But little snips of pieces here and there, they don't know. And many of them are so busy, proud being a Quander, the chest all popped out, and you ask them a question beyond that, and they cannot tell you. So no, it has not been, it's not very encouraging. And if you know somebody, you can give them a kick named Quander. I'd love it. But encourage people in your own families to do this. They've got to do something. Everybody has a history, and it may not be as glorious, or maybe more so. But until you do something, we're not all first this and most famous that, but we all have something, and we have to capture it so we can celebrate it and pass it on.
I have one final question before I get the mic back to Pamela. But when Alex Haley's Roots debuted in 1976, it really made an impact on Black America's understanding of the importance of their family ties and how integral the story of Black Americans were to the overall narrative of this country. What do you think this book, The Quanders, since 1684, an enduring African-American legacy, would do for Black people today in 2021? And I also wanted to ask, what do you think it'll do for white people today?
Well, first of all, Alex Haley's book is that we have that term faction, which came into existence because so much of it was fiction, so much of it was based on facts. But the Quander book, the intent was to base it purely on facts, documented facts, footnotes, etc. We may have to say probably, or we think that, we do that, but that is the key right there, to base it on that. And we want people to, so I'm a certified tour guide for the District of Columbia, had a tour yesterday, and we are always telling our students, because they're overwhelmingly white, not all, that what we're talking about who built this city is American history. I tell them right up, this is not Black history. That's a different tour. I do that too. This is American history. So we're stirring it in so that what our white brothers and sisters and Latino and Asian and whoever they are can see that the African-American contribution is at the heart of everything in this nation. And this nation began in August 1619, not the 4th of July, 1776. And I try to get people to understand that, but I get pushback too. I get people telling me, if I wanted a colored tour, I would ask for one. I said, well, first of all, lady, your word is out of date, but I didn't say that to her. So we just have to keep plugging away. Yeah, I'm sure that Paul Lawrence Dunbar would be very proud to know we haven't forgotten him.
Absolutely.
Judge Quander, it's been a pleasure.
Thank you. Nellie Quander worked with Paul Lawrence Dunbar's widow. She was a right-hander in World War I, monitoring the working conditions of colored and Negro women and girls in World War I in the work effort. And Alice Dunbar Nelson was in charge, and Nellie Quander was given some very important responsibilities working with her as a right hand, yes. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Thank you. Questions?
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. This has been
Thank you.
wonderful. We have a number of questions from our Zoom audience and our audience here at the Whittemore House. Laura, would you like to start?
All right, I have a lot of questions. Ms. Butler, you did such a great job of covering so many different parts of the book. One chapter that I found especially fascinating is when you returned to Ghana with your wife Carmen and met descendants of the Amaquando family. And you talk about, it's more of a guess, but an ancestor that you think might have originated the American Quanders. I was wondering if you could share a little bit more about that.
Well, of course, the history was oral. And when we went to Ghana, we knew we were from an area called Cape Coast, because that is where the Amaquandos were centered. And as we looked, before we went, we had a lot of correspondence, but the correspondence seemed to lead in the direction of a single person named Edum Amquando. So we were focused on him, and we like to say we don't know if he was the ancestor, but we feel we are comfortable in the right sector of the family in the Salt Pond area of Cape Coast. And so we went to the ancestral village where Edum Amquando was from. We went to the spot where he was captured and snatched, presumably in the 1660s, and transported here, where his record shows up, not him by name, in the 1670s. And we have the story of the two brothers who were brought here and separated and never were able to get together. but it appears that their descendants, first generation down, were able to get together. One line got free, and that's the one that got the freedom in 1686 under the 1684 will, and the other line stayed enslaved and gradually emerged over time. And the greatest group of after emancipation, yes. So that's basically that story.
This is a question for Mr. Calhoun and Ms. Butler. Can you expand a little bit on how you inspire your students to get involved with this kind of history?
Do you want to go first?
I guess I'll take that one. But one of the things I'd like to talk about is a project that we did with Mount Zion Cemetery. I remember going there on a self-guided tour, and we were supposed to go through Dunbar. Our main location was supposed to go to Dunbarton Oaks, but we had to go through Mount Zion. And while we went through Mount Zion, and those of you who aren't familiar, it's right here in Georgetown. It's one of the oldest African-American cemeteries here in the district. I had never heard of it because I'm from Miami, born and raised. And I remember when I went through it, I was like, oh, just learning that it might have a spot on the Underground Railroad, and also seeing that, many of the tombstones had, been in need of, of care. And and then going to Dunbar Oaks, which was a white cemetery that was just extremely pristine, and they're right next door to each other. It angered me. And I remember going back to school and telling my students about it, and hoping that they'd be interested in it. I remember I did some fundraising, applied for some grants, and I wasn't sure if my students were going to be on board. And when I introduced the idea to them, I had a waiting list. I had so many students, I didn't have a means of transportation to get them there. They wanted to do something, anything. So we were able to raise enough money for transportation. We were able to raise enough money from members all over the community and outside to feed the students. To not only that, we were able to raise money to get a plaque, and we got a beautiful park bench with an engraving on it. And we had a ceremony where we dedicated all that to our ancestors that were there. That's how you get our students.
Absolutely. And I just want to add on that I do very similar things. One of the things, we go to Georgetown and there's a scavenger hunt. And we talked about how do we get more sites? How do children learn about more sites? So they have to go take a picture, selfie next to each of the sites, and then they have to, report back. And then we have lunch, in Georgetown at well, doesn't matter where we have it different places. So the children get a chance to get out and be in nature, because I'm one of those teachers that believe, like Ms. Butler, that most of the learning happens outside of the classroom, or so much fundamental learning. The memorable parts happen outside the classroom. So that's what I try to do as well.
I have another question that follows up on that. One key to preserving the history of African Americans requires getting that history into textbooks. Have you considered an approach to achieving this goal, or what are your thoughts on the presence of these stories and the textbooks that you have available to you as teachers?
I think if we rely primarily on textbooks, then we're never going to get the complete story. I come from, I lived in Miami, Florida, and I had 3 different generations of family members that all lived within a 20-mile square radius. So family dinners, I would hear stories of my, great grandfather coming over in 1920 from the Bahamas as an immigrant, and the only job he can get was a rum runner in Miami. Hearing all the women in my family that were domestics, and just how proud I was of their experience. My grandfather being a World War II vet and not being able to get the GI Bill when he came back home to Florida. And then my father being one of the second group of Black men to integrate his local high school in the 1970s, by the way. And so my thing is that instilled in me at a very young age the love of history, but also it helped me realize that when I went to school, none of my family members' stories were in those textbooks. And so at a very young age, my pursuit was always to get who and what are the unheard stories. And my personal feeling is I don't rely on the textbook. I rely on primary source documents. I constantly dig. I constantly try to educate myself and go to seminars. And not only that, I encourage my students. We have one project that I had them do was a oral history, where my students had to find somebody in their community or family that had survived the 1968 riots here in DC. And they had to interview them, and they had to record them. And we established a website, and we shared those stories. And everyone was required to listen to someone else's story and write their thoughts. Yeah. To me, that's where the history is. I don't rely on it.
I mentioned, yes, let us say I mentioned early in the book that one of the aims and focus of this book was to tell the stories of what else was going on. We know about George Washington maybe, or somebody at that level, but what was happening in parallel universe? And the Quanders were in part inside of that parallel universe.
Yeah, I was just going to add that, again, it's a privilege for me, honestly, to be at Dunbar. We actually have a Black Studies Academy at Dunbar. It's the Carter G. Woodson Black Studies Academy. And I think the district has really moved away from textbooks. We've been moving away from textbooks in history, at least. We've been doing primary source documents for years now. So I think that having a concentration like a Black Studies Academy, where the students can have an opportunity to choose to be a part of that academy, and then you can utilize different elements of history to inspire them to be able to do more. Just to give, like, one of the projects that we were doing that's sort of connected to this is there's a company called African Ancestry that will trace your DNA. And one of the, I'm not going to say prizes, but one of the projects that we had was for one student to get that ancestry traced. So those are the kind of things that, we try to do at Dunbar to make those connections.
I need to give a little shameless plug for the Educational Foundation, because we actually looked at when we were starting to work on suffrage and the 19th Amendment, we looked at all the textbooks and how they covered suffrage. And they didn't have many women and they didn't have many Blacks. And we discovered one way you could get things into classrooms was to put them on calendars. And so it's one of the reasons our calendar this year is on women of color and the fight for the vote. But you can get a calendar hanging on a wall a lot faster than you can.
Your calendars are great. Your calendars are absolutely fantastic. We love the calendars. And I'm one of those teachers that when I go to the PDs, I take extras because the students, they like to take the calendars as well.
Oh, that's very
I shouldn't admit that, but I did.
Let me mention one other project, because we have Maura Campbell here, who we had a lovely grant from Humanities DC on oral history. And she did a beautiful video, a 5-minute video for high school students on how to conduct an oral history. And that may be another tool where you could engage your students.
Yeah, we use oral history at Dunbar too.
There are several questions that we've gotten here about the Quander relationship with various schools. A question, is there a connection with Georgetown University, with your family, the Rosenwald School, and then of course Dunbar?
Well,
Could you elaborate?
Yeah, I'll elaborate. The Preparatory High School for Colored Youth, Dunbar High School, of course, they had ancestral names, 1870 or 71?
1870.
1870. The Quanders had been students there, we know, from the 1890s, but I don't know about before, but maybe so. My father is a proud graduate of the class of 1936, and many of family members are graduates of Dunbar High School, the Dunbar High School, as I was told to remember, not just Dunbar, but the Dunbar. They went on to, after that, and to distinguish themselves at both Howard University and Minor Teachers College. The Georgetown connection is not nearly as much. My brother graduated from Georgetown, and I take student groups over there. When I was graduating from John Carroll High School, Georgetown was just beginning to integrate, and they visibly recruited around the Black students. So I wasn't even a candidate, and not that I wanted to go, but wasn't even a candidate to be considered for Georgetown University. As far as the Rosenwalds are concerned, my father was a first runner up on the last Rosenwald. He didn't get it, 1948. I know there's somebody who's a Rosenwald family member here, or maybe that came in on the video, but he was for the last Rosenwald, 1948, he was the first runner up, didn't get it. But we are very familiar. I know Judy Deutsch and the family. I've been to their home on East Capitol Street, and they're Rosenwalds too. So I do have a connection with the Rosenwalds, and very appreciative of what Mr. Julius Rosenwald did working with Booker T. Washington, and after Booker T. Washington, continue the great work to give our people schools. Several Quanders went to Rosenwald schools in Fairfax County and in Prince George's County. Yes. Now, if you want to come through the internet, you can send it to quanderquality.com. You can put www in front. Quanderquality.com, email info@quanderquality.com. And of course, if you want to, Barnes and Noble and Amazon, you can get it there. But if you get it there, same price, but it won't be individually signed. It will not have a Quander history stamp in it. So I encourage you to get it through me, same price. Thank you. That's where you can get it. Been my pleasure. I'm delighted. Thank you.
So much.